the 3D segment of this course, where we'll take Ilsa's godly tea brewer concept here and turn it into a functioning 3D game character. So the steps we'll go through will be to first sculpt out our tea brewer as a high poly mesh in ZBrush. Then we'll take her to Maya where we'll retopologize and UV her. Next we'll do some texture baking in Substance Painter, followed by some hand-painted texturing in 3D Coat, and finally some PBR texturing back in Substance Painter again. And as a last step, we'll do a quick and dirty auto rig for her in Maya so that we can make some poses and get some final renders out for a nice quality portfolio worthy piece. So just as a brief introduction and kind of a disclaimer, I'm not a professional instructor of any kind, and I don't really do teaching on a regular basis, but I have been working as a 3D artist for roughly 6 years now, so I'll be speaking more to my career journey and just some, industry pointers more than most tutorial videos throughout this demonstration. Since we've only got 3 hours here and a lot of stuff to cover, I won't go too deep into the technical aspects of 3D character creation since I think there's already a lot of videos out there that do that, but instead I'll get more into thought processes I have and decisions I'm making as I'm working, and of course a ton of tips and tricks along the way. This specific workflow that I'll show today isn't something every 3D character artist uses. Rather, each studio usually has their own specific way of doing things, and workflows can drastically change just depending on the art style that your game is looking to hit. But this is my personal favorite workflow and how I've been working in majority of the projects that I've been on. And even still, since I'll mostly be discussing theory and thought processes like I mentioned before, I think there's still something to take away from this demonstration, even for folks that aren't using the same softwares or maybe even working in more realistic asset production. So starting off, because we're making a game character, we first need to see what's needed in terms of the game itself to figure out how to create our character. A lot of the visuals get figured out in the concept stage, but in terms of technical and in-game specs, there's still a lot for us to figure out. For instance, if we're making a 5v5 MOBA style game, there's going to be a lot of playable characters and animations happening all at the same time, not to mention an entire environment loaded in at once, so we might be kind of limited in terms of our poly count, texture size, or shader capabilities. And even just from a visuals point of view, perhaps our camera is shooting down from top down, so we need to build our characters with proper readability from the top, which means more of a focus on the head, shoulders, and back areas. Or maybe as a final example, we're playing from a third-person point of view, and then our characters' backs would need to look just as interesting in detail as the front, since that's what we'll be seeing for most of the game. We might even need to set up our character meshes in a way that would work in various systems. For instance, if the game needs modular assets for character customization, or maybe just a separate backpack asset or something that can be taken off and put on by the player during the game. It's also good to remember that we're just character artists. We're working within a larger pipeline, so sometimes other disciplines will need things made or delivered a certain way for their part of the pipeline. That's why communication is super crucial in game development, and just trying to make sure everyone is working towards the same goals in creating meaningful assets that can be handed off down the chain. These things are all super difficult to judge in our case without a full game team to work to conclusions with and a fully designed realized game. So for our mock game, we'll just do things the best and most comfy for us 3D artists and just make sure we're showcasing a lovely 3D character within some reasonable game limitations. So far, during our brainstorm phase, we've stated that our game will be focused around this single character traversing a number of environments to look for different ingredients and mostly just being quick and agile. Because of that, I'm kind of assuming we'll want our game to be a bit more immersive, so maybe from a third-person point of view, and we can probably go a bit heavier in terms of technical specs for our character, since she'll likely be the only one on screen for a majority of the game. Style-wise, I've also decided to do a more stylized hand-painted PBR textures route so that we can stay true to Ilsa's vision and keep her lovely illustrative style alive. At this point, I'm thinking I'll go a bit more detailed in the texturing than in the concept to keep it interesting from just all kinds of camera angles and maybe even some mid-range medium shots and maybe some close-ups. I'm referencing a lot the League of Legends Runeterra cinematics and Arcane for those lovely hand-painted textures, but also some fairy tale illustrations for their shading simplification and whimsical style. But for the most part, just looking at how Ilse painted the concept, as well as her earlier iterations of the Tea Brewer, is helping me a lot. Plus, looking at her personal work to just get a better understanding of her style is a great way to start too. In terms of sculpting the model itself, I think I'll stay as close as possible to the complexity and detail level of Ilse's concept. I love a lot of the shapes she's chosen, and I'll probably just adjust a few areas to add a bit more 3D depth to them, or to add a bit of texture and material definition. Just as a preface too, at this point we've only received the earlier concept iterations from Ilse and this front view of our tea brewer. She's currently working on the orthographic views, which means we still aren't 100% sure what the back of our character looks like, and we can only sort of guess at what the sides will be like. I don't necessarily ask for or always receive orthographics during production, though they're really nice to have and drastically speed up the 3D modeling process. But I usually like to at least have a front and back view before starting so I fully know what's going on. Sometimes these things happen though, and if concept needs a bit more time to like lock in a design or just scheduling conflicts happen or life happens, you know. What we do have though should be enough to at least flesh out the body proportions and just start blocking out some of the clothing, hair, and other accessories on top. So it should be all good to begin with at least. The only thing we need to keep in mind at this point is to try and avoid the back area so we aren't sculpting out stuff that Ilse might change once she's done the back ortho view. And as for the teapot, we've got this one drawing, but since he's so symmetrical and simple, I think we can get away with using this all the way to final. But yeah, we'll see. So these are also the few references I've gathered just before I've started. Personally, I'm a bit chaotic when it comes to reference gathering, and I like to just pull things up as they come, and I feel like I need something. I'll talk about some of those down the line as they come up. I was also super fortunate and got a bunch of really great refs from Ilse, which are these ones. So now I can see a bit more of her thought process and a lot of the main ideas that she started with. Even if they're not like 100% represented in the concept, or if I've maybe misinterpreted something in the concept, this is a great way for me to get back on track and see what the initial ideas were for the tea brewer. As an example, one thing I misinterpreted before seeing these refs was the actual ethnicity of our tea brewer. At first glance from the concept, I thought she might have been a bit more South Asian, but from seeing Ilse's refs and talking with her, it was made clear that our tea brewer should represent some kind of African-based roots in some way. Of course, we've established she's not like an actual human with a real life culture and that kind of thing that should be represented, but if we're going to borrow from an existing race even vaguely, we should try and represent it properly. So I knew there were some iterations I wanted to do on the face at this point, and that I might deviate a bit from the concept to show the initial ideas better, which is why I've added some face references to my board just to start with. I've also grabbed some screenshots of Mel from Arcane, since she'll be a great skin tone reference when I'm painting textures, and I've also got my trusty 3D total figures on my desk in real life to reference for anatomy. These are pretty much invaluable to me, but as a substitute, when I don't have them around, you can also find similar digital 3D models that you can just open in any 3D software and look at for reference. And of course, my last bit of refs are just earlier iterations that Ilse has made for our tea brewer that I thought would still be useful for a bunch of different reasons, as well as some personality sketches and of course Ilse's own lovely personal work. At this point, if I'm working in a style I'm not familiar with, I'll probably start with a page of just artwork in that style that I need to learn. But since this whole project is pretty self-guided and the style falls pretty neatly into my comfort zone, I didn't feel like I really needed that much outside of just studying a bit of Ilse's personal style to see what I could yoink from her. So now that we're all prepared to start, let's get into it. So the first thing we're going to be doing is sculpting out our tea brewer as a high poly mesh in ZBrush. At the end of this section, we should have our 3D tea brewer character and her little teapot companion fully sculpted out in ZBrush. Begin, sometimes you'll be provided with like a base mesh or something from the project you're working on if they've got their pipeline set up in a specific way. But in most games, I've usually been able to just start however I like, unless I'm making skins for an existing character or something like that. So for our tea brewer, we've got this base mesh purchased from Marat Laripov on ArtStation Marketplace to begin with. And it's done a lot of the initial heavy lifting and mesh creation work for us, so we don't have to start from scratch. When I have a larger timeline to work with or when I'm doing personal work, I definitely prefer to build the body up from scratch, like from basic spheres or other primitives, just so I can squeeze in that important anatomy practice. But since our timeline is tight, as it usually is,